Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. We're going to get started right away so we can give each one of our speakers enough time to present on government accountability and the use of online resources. My name is Mary Ann Rodriguez, and I'm a program associate with the Mercatus Center's Capitol Hill campus. And for those of you who have never been to one of our programs or who are unfamiliar with the organization, we are a economic research and outreach institute devoted to helping policymakers get resources to help them in their policy work or in discussing important issues. And we have many courses throughout the year. Next week, we'll be featuring a course on the effects of a weak US dollar on the domestic and international economies with Dr. Ann Kruger from Johns Hopkins University. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. You have a flyer on the table before you, so feel free to pass it along to anyone in your office. And also, we do provide surveys. We just love to hear about what you liked about the program or didn't like or have any feedback or comments. So please take a second to jot down some of your thoughts after the program. Today's course is on the effect of changing technologies, most notably of the internet and online resources, and how these have affected government transparency and accountability in recent years. With us today, we have the Honorable Maurice McTigue, who is the Director of the Government Accountability Project at the Mercatus Centre and a former member of the New Zealand Parliament. We have Jerry Brito, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Centre. We have Robert Shea, who is an Associate Director with the Office of Management and Budget, who manages the Program Assessment Rating Tool. And we also have Derek Willis, a newsroom developer with the New York Times and one of the co-creators of the Washington Post Congress Votes database. So I will turn it over to Maurice McTigue.
Use this one. Thank you, Marianne. And it's nice to be back on Capitol Hill again. Particularly nice to be back on Capitol Hill with my friend Robert Shea. When I first came to the United States in 1997, Robert was working up here for Pete Sessions. And he was one of the early architects of support for the concepts of the Government Accountability, the Government Results Act, and managed those caucuses for a period of time. And it's great that he's actually taken those ideas to OMB and have made some progress on them. I'm going to talk to you very briefly just about the theory of accountability before some of the experts talk to you about what's now possible because of the development of technology. When I was in government in my own country in New Zealand, we had great ideas about transparency, but it was much more difficult to do because we didn't have the internet and we didn't have the ability for people to Google and find information instantaneously. So that world is changing very much, and it's making possible some of the things that weren't possible 10 and 15 years ago. What do I point this at? Oh, there we go. Technology is not my strong point, as you can see. This is just a definition of accountability. And we say accountability is that process that requires us to disclose, that word is important, fully and truthfully, those two words are important, our performance as the result of what we do to those who are entitled to know. I'm going to touch more significantly on requires us to disclose in a few moments, but fully and truthfully, you might think is not necessary for that to be said. But I can remember my office from time to time when I was a cabinet minister giving you exactly the information you asked for, but perhaps not the information you needed to be able to understand the problem that was being discussed. That's not fully and truthfully. When I went to school and the good nuns were teaching us about lying, not how to do it, but what constituted lying, there were a number of ways in which you could lie by clearly telling an untruth. But another one was by not telling the whole truth, so allowing people to only get part of the information. Another one was by disinformation, allowing people to believe something that you knew not to be true. And the last one was just by leaving the information out. So fully and truthfully is really important. Our performance In most other areas of our life where it used to being accountable for our performance, Starts when we're at school. You get grades according to how well you do or how badly you do. You do your best to try and hide them from your parents. And of course, that's what government departments do. They do their best to try and hide those results from you. One of the interesting things that's starting to evolve now is that governments have normally accounted for how they spent money, but haven't accounted for the results of what happened when we spent the money. And that's the missing part of the equation that we have to touch on. And I think increased transparency is going to give people like you and people like the media and the rest of us as citizens or researchers like Jerry the ability to be able to much better understand whether or not we're making progress on problems. And in my view, that's incredibly important. To those who are entitled to know is the last bit. You don't have to share all of the information in your family with everybody else, just those who are entitled to know in the family. Maybe not even your parents or your grandparents, maybe just between husband and wife. Boards of directors have to share their information with their shareholders, but also with potential shareholders, so they have to keep the market informed. But they don't necessarily have to inform every single person in the United States. But if you're an elected representative, then the duty is that you have to keep the electorate informed. And that's a much wider burden. So to those who are entitled to know is an important part of it. So what's this process do? Accountability provides a more open and transparent government so that there is public scrutiny of what's happening, and when there's public scrutiny, it's likely to change behaviour. We used to worry about this when I was in government, whether or not people were going to make the right decisions about the data. Now that I'm not in government and I don't have to worry about getting re-elected, don't worry about that any longer. What you really want to do is actually provoke the debate, because if you can provoke the debate, then it will bring about change. Not all of the change will be right the first time, but at least there is an understanding of the problem and there's attempts to actually address the problem. So how does accountability work? Properly constructed, it creates incentives. And those incentives are really based around our innate human nature, the desire to be thought well of by our peers, and because we know beforehand that we're going to have to disclose our performance, it lifts our performance before we even start, because we don't want to be thought badly of by those who are going to judge us, whether they're electors or whether they're shareholders or whether they're members of your parish or whether they're members of your family. Here's something that's been talked about quite a lot recently. And the first comment that I've got up there is this, the new $10,000 word. And I put that there because I did an interview on Talkback Radio in New Orleans on Monday. And one of the callers actually said that, what's this new $10,000 word that everybody's talking about in Louisiana? Because the new governor there is focusing on ethics reform down there. And I thought that it's worth repeating and it's worth trying to do some definitions around transparency. So what does transparency mean? In my view, it means that it can be seen. But there are essential ingredients that actually go to the quality of that transparency. And this goes back to that requirement to disclose. It's no good just saying that you did the disclosure. We did some analysis on Louisiana and we were looking for things like the performance reports that agencies put out. Some of the agencies in Louisiana wrote the reports and then filed them immediately in the archives. That doesn't quite meet the criteria for transparency. It should be somewhere where there's a chance that you'd actually find it. You know, like the department's website would be the logical place. The rest of the departments actually file them on the legislature's website under an obscure committee, but not where you would find them. So under that accessibility, it has to be somewhere where it's able to be found. Our view is that that means that it should be on the web. Readability. It has to be in a form that ordinary people can actually read it. We do a review each year of the reports of all of the government departments and agencies. In the initial stages of that process, NASA used to rate it with clearly highly qualified engineers, because anybody else wouldn't have a clue what was going in that document. They've got a lot better since then, so readability is important. Verifiability is important too. Can the information be believed? Completeness is the bit that I touched on, fully and truthfully, is all of the information there that would allow you as a reasonable citizen to be able to make a judgment. And then the last one is utility. Is the information there in a form that you can actually use it? If it's in one single file that's as large as the Encyclopedia Britannica, it doesn't meet that criterion. If it's in a form when you can't cut and patch it, doesn't meet that criterion. And Jerry's going to talk to you more about that. So the ingredients of transparency are important. Here are some of the big ticks, and we can give Robert a lot of credit for these. The Obama-Coburn Act and the federal spending website just new up this year, 2008, but a great step forward. And I'm sure that you people, how many people in the room have actually been to that website? About a tenth of you. By the end of the budget process, I would expect that every single one of you will have been there at least once, or you should have. There's some great information up there as to not exactly what the appropriation looks like, but how that appropriation is being spent individual by individual, contractor by contractor, sector by sector. And that's a big step forward. Wasn't available before. There's about 20 states who are currently copying that process, and that's good stuff. Placing budget justifications online is also another big step forward, and we can give OMB credit for doing that. Placing all of the part information online is also a big step forward. And the nice thing about these things that OMB has done is that they are in searchable forms, so that you can actually go through and you can research different stuff and you can actually find it. And of course the information that came from the Government Performance and Results Act is the foundation upon which all of this is built. So, these are the big crosses, the no's in my view. Secrecy. There are very few occasions in public life, in my view, where secrecy is justified. Certainly issues of national security are national security. To try and protect you from some kind of political problem is not a justification. We're entitled to know about those. You know, the best thing that you can do, in looking back on my political career, is if something gets screwed up, be the first one to admit the mistake, and then all of the discussions about how you resolve it. The instant you try and cover it up, it's a disaster. So secrecy needs to go. Usable, unusable information is also another no. Don't put it there in a form that can't be used. And the secrecy around earmarks, the secrecy around House Senate conferences. Why do they have to be conducted in secret? I'd like to know what was going on. Be nice to see that happen inside one of the meeting rooms here, wouldn't it? One of the committee rooms. I'd sit in there for a while, but I think that it would be less interesting than it is now, because I think a lot of the deals that happen now wouldn't happen if it was in front of all of us in the television cameras. So what we're talking about here is that we're dealing with some new technology, we're dealing with some new principles, and it's important in terms of getting the maximum out of both accountability and transparency. Without transparency, there is no accountability. Unless you and I can get the information, we can't make those decisions and we can't spark that debate. So to tell you more about the utility of information, my friend Jerry Brito.
Well, my name is Jerry Brito, and like Morris said, I'm going to talk to you about e-transparency, which is using online tools to make government transparency a reality. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why should we be transparent? And the answer is that transparency is good. Morris has already explained how transparency leads to accountability and why that's a good thing, so I won't rehash that. There are just 3 points that I want to make in the presentation today. The first is that government data is often not online. The second point is that when government data is online, it's often not usable. And last, that if government doesn't make usable data available online, third parties will. Now, there are many laws that already require disclosure. So, for example, the most basic example of this is the Constitution, right? Our most basic document of the law. And Article 1, Section 5, Clause 3 of the Constitution requires Congress to keep a journal of its activities. And on 1/5 vote of members present, they have to record the votes on anything that Congress does. And this is our founding fathers making transparency something that is a key value to our system. Transparency leads to accountability. You also have the Administrative Procedures Act, which requires agencies to publish proposed and final rules in the Federal Register. You have the E-Government Act of 2002 that requires the online publication of regulatory agency dockets. And unfortunately, the operative language in that act is to the extent possible. You have the Freedom of Information Act and the e-FOIA amendments that allow for the request of any government document. And you have the 1978 Ethics in Government Act, which requires the disclosure of financial information, so that all elected members of Congress, all elected officials in the federal government, all appointed officials, and all federal employees of a certain level have got to disclose their financial income and the sources of their income on an annual basis. Now, these laws require disclosure, but in today's day and age, disclosure really isn't meaningful unless it is online disclosure. Unfortunately, those laws that I mentioned really don't take the internet into account very well. And government data, even though there may be a law mandating that it be disclosed, is often not online. So for example, I'll give you some examples of these sort of phenomena. Regulatory agency dockets, where the agencies are, or where agencies make decisions that affect millions of Americans. And regulatory agency dockets are not available online in many cases. You have OMB coming out with regulations.gov, which is a great website, it's a great step forward. It's trying to put together one unified federal docket system. Unfortunately, it's not complete. It's still a voluntary system where not every federal agency is participating. There are some other drawbacks to regulations.gov that I can discuss later. You've got e-FOIA. Now, a 2007 survey of 149 agency websites by the National Security Archive at George Washington University found, quote, massive non-compliance with e-FOIA. Only a fifth of the agencies reviewed made available on their website all the data that is required by FOIA. And according to the report, 41% of agencies have not posted their most requested documents as the way as FOIA mandates. What happens is FOIA allows citizens to request any document from an agency. When an agency gets the same request over and over and over, FOIA tells it you must put this document online. And 41% of the agencies are just not doing it. Income disclosure, which I mentioned earlier. If you want to know how much your congressman makes and where that money is coming from, you are entitled to get that. And you can go where? You can go to the clerk of the House, Secretary of the Senate, or for the executive branch, you can go to the Office of Government Ethics. But this information is not available online. You've got to come to a basement here on the Hill and fill out a form and get that information. Now, this is not very useful to somebody who lives in Iowa and wants to know how much they owe. So, even when the government does publish data online, it's often not in a usable format, the way Lawrence was describing. And if it's not usable, you can't find the information, you can't manipulate it, you can't cut and paste it, it might as well not be online at all. Let's look at some examples of this. Take the FCC. I like to pick on the FCC because it's one of the agencies I'm familiar with my work on telecom. And it's also an agency with a very active docket and a constituency and a management that you would think would understand the internet. The same Federal Communications Commission is for communications. Full dockets, full regulatory dockets are available on the FCC website, but they're not usable except by Navy experts. This is what the FCC website looks when you're going to search for any sort of regulatory document. Now, suppose you're a mother in New Mexico who has 3 kids, and their kids plays video games, and the FCC is conducting a proceeding to regulate video games. So you know that you want to read what the proposed regulation is, you want to read what the comments to regulation is from industry, from consumer groups. You come here, you want to post your own comment. Where do you search for video games? There's nothing here where you can type in the word video games and get the docket, right? You have got to know what the docket number is. Now, unless you're a lobbyist here in DC, you're not going to know what that number is. If you do know that number, right up comes the docket with all the information. Now, here's the second problem. Even if you knew what, even if you were able to search for the word video games, it might not do you much good. Because a lot of the documents, in the FCC's regulatory docket, are saved as image PDFs. Now, this is something you're all probably familiar with. You know how you have PDFs sometimes that you can copy and paste from? Those are text. Those are searchable. And sometimes you have PDFs, you try to copy it, and you can't. They're an image. And a lot of the documents, a lot of the regulatory agency dockets online are just not searchable, not able to manipulate. The FCC also doesn't offer any RSS feeds or any structured data. I'll get to that in a minute. So the data may be online, but it's not usable. So what is usable data? What does it look like? Well, usable has two main components. First is the data must be searchable. And second is the data must be structured. Now, these are terms of art, and I'll tell you what they mean. First, what is searchable? It's pretty obvious, but I'll just recap. Number one, it's got to be text. It can't be an image that you can't search. It's got to be a format that you can actually search. Number two, it can't be blocked. The FCC does a very funny thing, and the FCC is one of the several agencies that does this. All websites have a very simple way for you to turn a switch and say, I don't want you to index me, right? What does that mean? Google, Yahoo, and all the other commercial search engines send out little robots that look at a site, look at what's on the site, and that's how they know when you type in a search to send you there. You can tell a commercial website, I don't want to be searched. And the FCC has this turned on. So there's no way that you can ever do a Google search and get to the documents that are in the FCC docket. And there's several other agencies that do this too. So when you're talking about searchable, you can't have that turned on. You can't block access to your site. So what is structured? This is the second thing that we need to have a real usable website. Structured means machine readable. It means that a computer can tell different parts of the document and can help you manipulate the document accordingly. So let me try to explain what this means. Now, what is this here? This is a bill. We all can look at this and we know this. Humans can look at a document like this and tell apart the different sections. If I were to ask you, on what date was this document published, you could tell me, right? Machines, however, can't do this. What a machine sees when it looks at a document like that is this. It's just text to it. It doesn't know that what the different fonts are, or different sizes, different positions. So if I ask the computer what date was this document published, it wouldn't know to look right there. But there's a way to allow machines to read documents the way that you and I do. You structure the data, right? And so what have we done here? We've just put little tags to indicate where the sections begin and end, right? Let's add some spaces here to let us humans see it a little bit better, right? You can see bill, begin build, and the build number, and end build. Begin title, the title, and the end title, right? So now I can ask a computer on which date was this document published, and it knows where to look. It looks right there between the date tags. Now, this is one of many documents. Let's say that this is one of 1,000 documents. I can now ask the computer, show me all the documents that are published on the same date, right? And it's able to look between the date tags and it gives me all the documents on the same date. That's where computers shine, is in their computational power. I can even ask the computer, show me all the documents out of the thousands that you have, where the author began to the letter A and were published on odd number days. The computer can do that quickly if the data is structured. Now, the New York Times, for example, just about every website on the internet, just about every blog, structures their data, right? You not only have the HTML document that you're presented with when you're browsing, but there's also a mirror XML document, which is structured data. And so every story, every news story in the New York Times has a structured document that goes along with it, and maybe Derek can explain this a little bit better, that says, has a structure with the title, the byline, the date, the section of the newspaper. Now, what does that help you do? How many of you here use RSS feeds? What they are? Okay, a lot of you. You can subscribe to an RSS feed for, let's say, the New York Times. And every time something is published in the New York Times, you don't have to go visit the website and see that the item is there. You're automatically alerted. But because the data is structured, you can subscribe to just one of the tags, one of the structured tags. So you can say, I just want to see the garden section. I just want to see the automotive section. And every time something is published in the garden section, you're alerted. Or the Times also has something called Times Topics, which are the most popular keywords that people search for. So George W. Bush would be a keyword. You can subscribe to that keyword, and anytime something is published in the New York Times, whether it's in the garden section or the automotive section with George W. Bush, you're alerted. Now, imagine if the FCC were to use structured data. They offered RSS feeds. You could subscribe to the FCC's dockets. And every time they publish a new proposed regulation or comments came in, you would be alerted. Or you could subscribe to the EPA or Department of Transportation, right? Even better, imagine if you could subscribe to the cable bureau of the FCC, or just the wireless bureau of the FCC, because that's what you're interested in. Or even better, suppose you're that mom. You could subscribe to the video games we're going to docket, and every time a new comment is posted, you would be alerted to it. Now that's transparency, and that leads to accountability. So this brings me to my last point, which is that if government doesn't provide usable data, third parties will. For example, take the Washington Post Congressional Votes database, which Derek will talk to you about. Nothing like this is available officially from the government. Right? You can search for votes on bills by member, by class, by any number of criteria. Why? Because they've structured the data. You know, for example, you can look at votes by legislator. There's no place in any congressional website where you can pick your member of Congress and see all of their votes. So here is Speaker Pelosi's page on the Congressional Votes database, and you see got bio information, key votes. Now look at this. This is interesting. Financial disclosure information. Oh, right here, online available, is her financial disclosure statements, which I said a minute ago were not available online. How is this possible? Well, this is possible because the folks at the Washington Post sent people over here to the Hill, to the basement, to grab those documents and scan them in and put them online. Why is government not doing this itself? Let's look further down on the page for Nancy Pelosi. You've got Ms. Snowden dealing with the party. You know, any number of ways that you can slice and dice this. And look at this. There is an XML feed. There's an RSS feed. You can now subscribe to your member of Congress, and every time that they vote, you're alerted to how they voted. So the question you're asking yourself, though, is if third parties are going to do this, why should we bother? Well, there's two things. The first is data integrity, right? How does the Washington Post database get this information? And I'll let Derek explain how this works. But basically, they send out little robots that grab the information and they read the web pages on the congressional sites and pull it in. This is a pretty accurate way to do it, right? But it's not 100% accurate. And when you're talking about something like FTC data, where you're looking at numbers, you're looking at dollar figures, it's pretty important to get this right. So even though screen scraping, which is what this technology is called, is maybe 97, 98% effective, it's not 100% effective. You want that. The second thing is that it's cheaper. Derek has to build these robots to go out and do this. That costs money. Every time the Senate webmaster changes the page, he's got to rewrite those robots. He's got to send people out to a basement here to get the financial disclosure forms. That costs a lot of money. Where Congress and government generally, all the agencies, they can just export their data as structured information and put it online in a much cheaper way. So, some recommendations. First, I just want to make you aware of a couple of bills. First is the E-Government Authorization Act of 2007, which addresses the problem where Google and other commercial search engines can't search government websites. The other is H.R. 170, the Sunlight Act of 2007, which requires certain disclosures, including FTC data, to be in XML format. And also, I understand that Senator Lieberman has offered support for publishing Senate votes in XML format, something that the Senate does not do right now. Actually, the House does do it. It will be bringing the Senate up in line with the House. So here's some of my recommendations very simply. First, require disclosures to be made online. Very simple. Like I said, there are many laws that already require disclosure, they're just not being made online. So technically, these disclosures are complied with, but you can't find the data. If you want to be bold, redefine the meaning of disclosure, right? Just pass a law that says any data that right now is required to be publicly available isn't publicly available until it is online. Second, require these disclosures to be in a structured format, and I just went over why that's important. And finally, do this all with the purpose of allowing third parties to manipulate and build upon the data, right? Derek can explain why that's important, why being able to manipulate the data leads to new innovations that you never have thought of before. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Derek. Thank you. Oh, Derek. Robert's first.
Thank you very much. Is this on?
Yeah, I think so, but you might have to...
Yeah, can you hear me? All right. It'd be ironic for you not be able to hear me. Is this, can you hear me? You can hear me? I'm sorry. I don't want to underestimate the challenge. So I was looking through some emails, and I want you to see how we communicate at OMB with each other over email. HSPD 12 requires e-verify checks of non-U.S. citizens. FIPS 201 specifies the valid forms of identification an individual must present prior to being issued a credential. I'm not aware of any issues from an HSPD 12 security perspective. My understanding is that M0721 requires all federal departments and agencies to begin verifying new hires through e-verify. Now, I have a vague understanding of what that means, but you can literally come out of meetings or phone calls in the government and not have the slightest idea what anybody said. They don't communicate like human beings. So that is a major challenge. People don't communicate things clearly. That's why we have initiatives like plain language, translating governmentese into words that people can understand. I'd like to talk to you about some of my experiences, which are very limited, but of which I'm proud, to improve transparency into how we at OMB oversee the government's management. We have a system in place to address major management challenges at agencies. It's called the President's Management Agenda Scorecard. We also, as Morris mentioned, we assess programs with the Program Assessment Rating Tool. It's a series of questions we ask about how well a program is performing and being managed and what it's doing to improve. All of that has always, since day one, been available on the internet for people to scrutinize, and that was one of the major, it was very controversial, especially with the agencies that were being graded at the launch of these initiatives. Agencies were extremely hesitant to post information that might cast them in a bad light, and they didn't see why the political appointees at OMB would think it was a good idea either, because that would disadvantage the president. But as Morris said, and as we believe to our core, you can't hold people accountable for improving or performing as they said they would without transparency. Transparency into what they plan to do, transparency into whether they actually did it, and then what you're going to do to hold them accountable. So while we had in the early days all of the data about how well agencies were performing on the management agenda and how well programs were achieving their goals, we didn't find, the traffic on our sites, the degree to which we were getting any traction with this information was very limited. So with the PART, you took these, for each program, there was a 12-page spreadsheet with all of the questions, the answers to all of the questions, and the evidence on which they were based embedded in them. But we took the time to hire a website designer, first of all. We don't have a lot of really cool website designers at OMB, as you can imagine. But we also went around the country and did focus groups on the information. It's hard to find anybody who thought there'd be any value in this kind of information, but we found them. And in 4 different focus groups, it's like we wasted money on the 3 that followed the first one because they all said precisely the same thing. They all wanted the same kind of information in the same format. And so we went, in addition to redesigning the site, we translated every single program assessment into a 1-page summary that should be easy to understand. We formatted the data in a way that was much more accessible. We over time moved links around to make the information that people thought to be more accessible, more logical. And today more people know what the PART is, what programs are doing to improve, than when we launched this process. We're not where we should be. This is still pretty rough information. But we've made a commitment to improve its accessibility, and we've taken concrete steps over time to improve it. Likewise with the scorecard, we've improved the clarity of the color grades we assign to agencies, and whether or not it's accessible to the American people. The folks who are being graded pay really close attention to this information, and they are motivated. This incentivizes them to improve. Shame can't be underestimated as a motivator of behavior. And cabinet secretaries will act highly silly if they're not getting a good enough grade, and they will take whatever steps are necessary to improve. Now let me tell you a story about USAspending.gov. A couple of years ago, Senators Coburn and Obama drafted and introduced legislation to require every financial transactions entered into by the government to be posted on the internet. And we at OMB, because we have all wisdom, and I'm not so bad at persuading people, I was given the task of convincing Senators Coburn and Obama and their staffs that this legislation was not necessary, that all the information was on the internet and available. You just had to know where it was and be able to go find it. I failed. I had a parade of experts on this data come up and explain to the staff why this information didn't need to be any more accessible. It was already right there. And they were so arrogant and obtuse about why the information didn't need to be any more accessible and usable that it virtually guaranteed enactment of that law. Those staff members to this day think it's the biggest waste of effort because the information was already there and available. But as you know, the act was passed. In an interesting, ironic twist, transparency was provided into who was holding up the bill. That led to an outcry, which fleshed out the holds and forced support for the bill and its eventual enactment. So, as punishment, I was tasked with implementing the act. And the fear was the cost estimate for the bill ranged from anywhere from $5 million a year to $60 million over 5 years. And we weren't given any money to enact the legislation. And what we saw was that Sunlight Foundation and OMB Watch, a traditional enemy critic of OMB's, had already developed a site. And we thought, why don't we just buy their software and require agencies to produce this data on a more regular basis? And everybody said that was impossible. But that's what we did. We bought the software, require agencies to provide the data in a way that allows it to be loaded onto the site. And we told the stakeholders as clearly as we could, look, at launch, we are not going to be anywhere near where you want us to be. All of the data that's required to be posted on the site will not be available. But we'll be able to say it's more searchable than ever before. There's more data on this site than on any other site. And we will candidly grade agency compliance with our requirements and the law and improve over time. And that's what we're doing. And I think the information would meet, the data would meet even your standards. And we're learning from this experience. Government is slow to adapt, but we are doing what we can. We're like gerbils in an exercise wheel, trying to keep up with these new changes and make information more accessible. I've got notes. We're going to go and talk to the FCC and others to make sure that we are making this information as transparent as possible. We did. I apologize that you all didn't get your copy of the budget this year, but in an effort to save trees and paper and a few bucks, but also to improve transparency, we instead of buying a bunch of hard copies of the budget, we made the online information much more accessible. So you can get not only information about the president's budget, but at budget.gov you can get information about each agency's congressional justification. You can get information about each agency's annual performance, its financial statements, its long-term strategic planning, how each of its programs are assessed. And there's a lot more information that can be much more available and much more user-friendly. But the pressure needs to be kept on to improve this transparency. The President signed an executive order in December, the Improving Government Performance executive order, that said each agency has to have available on its site its long-term strategic plan, its annual performance plan, its annual financial and performance reports, the assessment of its programs, improvement plans for major issues identified by GAO and their IG, as another step in improving transparency and accountability for performance. Can't underestimate enough. I can't overestimate the challenge to improving transparency, because it's just foreign to government, but also the importance of it. Agencies' behavior won't be incented to change unless what they plan to do is transparent to you and they're held accountable for doing what they said they would do. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Yes, I'm Derek Willis. I now work at the New York Times. And if you're wondering why a guy from the New York Times is going to talk to you about the Post votes database, it's because I was a co-creator in the votes database at the Washington Post. Has everybody seen this or heard of it or even sent us email complaining about it occasionally? We did occasionally get emails from people saying, you know, you have my boss as being absent and he had surgery, so could you please note that? So sometimes we did, sometimes I want to talk a little bit just about sort of how it came about, because I used to work for Congressional Quarterly covering the House, and so when at CQ builds its own votes database by hand. For those who subscribe to CQ.com, what you get is the product of people sitting up in the House gallery and the Senate gallery typing in the votes, which is incredibly useful but incredibly inefficient. But when I left CQ, I lost access to that database, and I thought, crap, because it was really helpful in helping me understand things that were going on. And so I thought, well, there's got to be some way I can put this in front of the rest of our reporters, and also put it in front of the public. And so there's that. The other thing is the data was available in some form. It wasn't perfect, but it was available. The House, for example, as Jerry was saying, publishes it in a very, very nice format, and I want to thank the folks at the House for that, because it makes our jobs easier. But, and the Senate, is not the Senate's incapable of doing this. They do this, and in fact, they published it in a very similar format to what the House has published, except that they took that down and then decided not to publish it that way again. So we all know the Senate does what it likes, and maybe we'll get there someday. The third thing is we had the ability to do it. And I cannot stress enough what Jerry said about, if you don't do this kind of stuff, other third parties will do it for you. And it's a large undertaking, or can be a large undertaking. But let me just talk a little bit about what it is that the actual physical tools that we use to develop this database. These are all, not to be too geeky, but these are all software or database components. But the thing that you should take away from these is that all of these cost nothing, $0. So in other words, all we did was spend the time to build the database, to write the program to build the database. And it costs us, and continues to cost the Post in terms of upkeep, nothing. The program runs. It runs if there's a missile attack on the Post building, in fact. I mean, well, let's hope not. But if there is, in some other data center, this program will run, assuming the websites of the House and the Senate are up. It will run until we turn it off. The only human intervention that's required is in the unfortunate circumstance of a member's death or sudden resignation. The program that we wrote is smart enough to recognize when new members are sworn in and when they appear in the votes, in the listing of votes, and it just adds them to our database. So, and if we could pull this off, And if people from the news media, which again is probably maybe slightly ahead of government in innovation, slightly. I mean, we're still working on the concept that like the best way to get your paper is to hire somebody to throw it on your lawn at 5 or 6 in the morning. This is not an innovation. We're not really good at this sort of thing.
It works. Don't screw
it
it
works,
up.
right? Exactly. That's the thing. We're the folks who will not cut your stock tables because, God forbid, your 98-year-old grandmother calls up and says, "I can't check my phone. I'm canceling my subscription." Chaos ensues. So we're not innovative people by nature. But there are 2 things that newspaper publishers understand. One of them is traffic, just general eyeballs, and the second thing is cheap. They understand cheap better than you would think. And so what we did was, and some people have asked us a lot of questions about the votes database and why we did certain things. And one of the first things we wanted to do was we wanted to do missed votes. And frankly, I wanted to do missed votes because I was tired of calculating it myself. And because, quite frankly, and for reasons that are somewhat understandable, if you go to a member's website, it's probably not going to say, especially right on the front, member X missed this many votes this year, or was here or there and did not vote. You're not going to see that. And I understand from the member's perspective why that would not necessarily be a prominent thing to propose, but I would also submit that it's probably useful information. And so missed votes were one of the first things that we added because it seemed like a logical thing. One of the second things we added was voting with your party. And this was something, again, that grew out of my experience as Congressional Quarterly, because Congressional Quarterly does these scores at the end of the year. And I always thought they were fairly interesting, but I also thought we should have them throughout the year, not just at the end of the year. And so you would see, how often people voted with a majority of their colleagues. Every once in a while on the internet, somebody links to one of these pages and says, and tries to use this as an example of partisanship, to say Democrats are more partisan or Republicans are more partisan. And when I see those, sometimes I'm compelled to go to that site and leave a comment saying, it goes a little deeper than that. It's not purely partisanship. It sort of speaks more to voting behavior, and particularly in the House, when you have changes of majorities and things like that, then you notice like the scores tend to go, you'll notice that in the 110th Congress, the highest scores for voting the parties in the House are almost all Democrats, and in the 109th Congress it was the opposite. And that's sort of a function, and it tells you something about how a majority has to operate in a legislature. So there are things like that. And then last fall, one of the last things I did before I left the Post was one of our reporters was poking around with approval of the journal votes. And as a former CQ alum, I love journal votes. I don't understand why they're not more popular with the mass audience. Actually, I kind of do. But one of the things he was interested in was, and sorry I can't scroll down here, but basically the theory as we were testing it out was that if Democrats are in the majority, journal votes get a significant number of no votes. In other words, Republicans tend to, as a bloc, vote against approval of the journal when they're in the minority. Whereas when Democrats were in the minority, it was only about 40 or 50 Democrats would vote against the journal consistently. And most Democrats would just vote for it and be done with it. And so it was curious to our reporters, like, why in fact that was. And the subtext of that was also curious to reporters why certain Democrats always voted against the journal. And we got a story out of this at the Post because, frankly, that's the kind of knee-deep political coverage that the Post likes to do. And I don't know, it would be fascinating to everyone, but it does reveal a little bit about the workings of the institution, and that's basically what this tries to enhance. Now, how many of you have seen the vote breakdown by astrological sign on the vote statement? Anyone? Anyone seen that? That was probably that was the feature that we added at the request of my co-creator, a guy named Adrian Holovati. Adrian is a brilliant programmer, designed the code that runs almost all of the site. And Adrian added in, he came to me and said, I think we ought to add this in. And I said, Adrian, this is kind of silly, isn't it? I mean, the Cancers and the Leos. And he's like, well, look, think of it this way. And he's absolutely right. If you don't know, if you're coming to this site and you don't know anything about Congress, or all you know, maybe you know your member's name, and that's all you know. And you look at a breakdown of a vote, and it has this language on, on the motion and the question, the reverse, and the ruling, and the chair, and this and that and the other, and the 3/5 is required. And you see all that legislative language. And then you see the astrological signs, and you think, hey, I know that. I know that. I know what I am, or I know what, and if we can offer people one way to get into that information, one entry point into an otherwise obscure, arcane, legislative language, then we should do it. And our thinking with the internet is not, it's not the same, and this is tough for newspapers to get, but it applies everywhere to any publisher of information online, is that if it's worth doing for one person, it's worth doing. Because in paper, in print, we can't make that bargain. We can't say it's worth doing for one person, so we're gonna tear up the paper and do it for one person. It's not worth our time or money. But on the internet, it is worth our time and money in most cases. And so when we talk about benefits and features and things to add, frankly, there isn't really much that if someone can make a decent case for it, we'll probably do it. This was our policy at the Post, and this is the policy, sort of working policies were kind of developed at the Times now. And so, it's really, I would say that the greatest thing about my experience with the Votes database has been what people did with this information after we published it. Jerry was showing you the member page for the speaker, and honestly, we didn't give more than a couple moments thought to what will go on every member's page, until we noticed that people out on the internet were linking to member pages when they were referencing them in blogs or other things. And that was becoming kind of a small but de facto standard. They'd write about Senator McCain, and they'd link to our page about Senator McCain. We thought, well, this is a little weird. We didn't really anticipate that. And there's a bit of a frightening moment there when you're like, well, we're not really in control of our own app anymore. Other people are using it, and we don't know how they're using it, and we can't control how they're using it. And you know what? You got to get over that, because unless you're going to track down all these people, there's nothing you can do. If you become an online publisher, controlling your audience isn't really one of the things that is available to you. And so when we went with the flow, when we decided to beef up member pages, because they seem to be getting more attention. And so sometimes when you are transparent and when you're not really sure what'll work, I always like to say, let's throw some spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks. And obviously, it's easier for a private organization perhaps to do that than it is for the government necessarily to do that. But the key is if you don't know what's going to be useful, why not make it all available, or as much as you can? Because, yeah, maybe some things never get looked at, and you decide, fine, but there's no real punishment to you for being as transparent as possible. So, for that, I think we're close to time. But if anyone has any questions about the Votes database or the other panelists, I'll be around. We'll be around. So, thanks for your attention.
You want to take questions?
Yeah, yep. We're going to take some questions if you guys like to fire away. Yes, sir.
No, I found the first two presentations pretty disturbing. And the reason is, I found the two first presentations kind of disturbing, and the reason is that I don't think much thought was given to how the internet really has changed the world, and we're using static FOIA definitions in a very dynamic situation. I didn't hear mention the word international and the fact that Osama bin Laden or Putin can search the same databases that other people can. And when we're talking about regulatory databases, I don't know that much about FCC. I know a little more about Nuclear Regulatory Commission and FAA. And those are two, I'm sure that Osama bin Laden didn't have the ability to search before 9/11. Because if I don't think we can assume that everyone who is searching is searching for a good reason.
Sure, let me address that, and I'll let Morris talk about that as well. What I would say is this, is that the information that I would like to see online is information that is already public, information that is already accessible. So somebody like Putin or Osama bin Laden, if they're intent on getting on information, they can just walk to whatever building's information is in, that is a public building, and you can ask if there's a public photocopy, you make a photocopy. So the information is available. I'm just asking that it be online. So really this doesn't, it marginally lowers the cost for a wrongdoer, but that marginal cost that you're going to be taking, you're going to make up in all the great stuff you're going to get from having information.
I think we need to start from the premise of saying in an open and free society, all government information is free unless there is a good public interest reason for it not being available. If we look at the worst societies on earth, they are the most secretive. And if we look at the best societies, they are the most open and free. And clearly there is a range in between. We're not really talking about security information or sensitive security information. What we're really talking about is, do we, the people, have the right to be able to make an informed decision about how well our government and our legislature works? And we would take the position that yes, we the people do have that right, and we can make that right more readily available to people by putting information on the net in a searchable form. Does it prejudice our security interests? In most cases, no, because we're not going to put up sensitive DHS information, and we're not going to put up CIA information. But whether or not the programs on poverty work, I think is some of the kind of things we should know about.
Let me ask one other thing for the gentleman from OMB. Are you willing, in transparency, if you have a budget online, are you willing to put the budget history on the budget guidance, the appeals, and that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I bet it would be. The no, I mean we're very protective, very protective about our deliberative process, so that it's not chill. You know, your point about security. There's a negative. You gotta make a reasonable effort to think through the consequences of transparency. I think the presumption ought to be, the rebuttable presumption ought to be that the information ought to be out there. We want to make sure that we can have internal debates about what the president's recommendation is going to be, and that all of the information he's using to justify his decision ought to be available.
One of my jobs in Cabinet was to put together the spending part of the budget. For any one item, I might have as many as 20 proposals. At either end of that range are proposals there is no chance in hell we were ever going to agree to. I don't think there's any need to publish those. And then you're going to have a number of issues that I think are relevant. The public should know what is it that you were considering, and they should know whether or not you decided to do it or decided against doing it, and they should have a reason. Why did we decide that this was a good idea or a bad idea? And then I think that that's debatable. It might mean that from time to time you get into trouble over that. I don't care about that. That's okay. And it might mean that some people say, hey, good idea, I'm right on side with you. But I think that you can make the process too cumbersome by saying every option, even though most of them were ridiculous, has to be published. That, in my view, I think would be confusion, not transparency.
And that's why caucus is on.
It specializes in confusion.
You had talked about on the FCC website that they weren't searchable because they used images instead of text, and I was wondering what the FCC's reasoning is for doing that. I don't know very much about it. I thought that you couldn't alter it by copying and pasting. That might have been the reason. What's their?
I think it's just that it hasn't been explained what is the proper way of making a PDF. Quite simply, they haven't invested in technological education. So I've seen documents at the FCC and at other documents, at other agencies, where what they do is the following: they want to put up, they've created an official document, say they're going to issue a new regulation. They want to put that online. Instead of taking that Word document and exporting it to PDF and putting that online, what they'll do is that they print it out and they take it to a scanner, they scan it in, and they put that online, and it's not searchable. So ignorance is one thing. The other thing that might be a little bit more malevolent is the following: is that what is part of the dockets? A lot of the dockets are comments, right, from industry groups or consumer groups or other folks interested who send in their comments. If you mail in your comment rather than sending it in electronically, your letter is scanned and put up as an image, so it's not searchable. So I wonder, this is just me being cynical, I wonder to what extent some folks who don't want their comment to be searchable mail it in or courier it rather than send it in electronically. But
even if that's the case, the FCC could take steps to something called optical character recognition. Basically, even if you get a paper letter, you can extract text as electronic text. Any other questions?
Hi, Rob Pearson from Congressman Honda's office. I had 2 brief questions. One for Derek. On our website, we actually link to the Washington Post, the database about my member. It's a great way to allow our constituents to quickly find out about the Boston voting record. I know of other offices that actually manually create what you guys do on their website. I was wondering if you guys have any plans or thoughts on allowing us to embed that information within our own website?
I can't speak for what the Post is planning to do, but for what our plans are at the Times, because since it's the Post doing stuff, the Times, we have to do it as well and try to do it better. We are planning to offer what known as APIs, so you could grab the data and use it in certain ways on your own site or publish it on another site. I mean, in theory, like right now, you could do that with the RSS feed of the current votes. You could take that and have somebody essentially write a little script that would publish it back out and make it usable. But it's not the easiest thing, but it is technically possible. I mean, I know that we find that other people use the RSS feeds in interesting and sometimes creative ways to do that, to do exactly that, to publish it back out. So if people want to do that, by all means, I mean, that's what it's there for.
I also had a question for the gentleman from the OMB. I was wondering if at the OMB you consider groups like the Sunlight Foundation to be stakeholders and solicit their opinion on most effective ways of presenting information.
The Sunlight Foundation, through OMB Watch, was with whom we partnered to design and launch usaspending.gov. OMB Watch is also a vocal critic of the PART, the Program Assessment Rating Tool, but have lauded our improved transparency, which in many cases is in direct response to some of their criticism, and the Mercatus Center as well. So we've really been responsive to pretty specific requests for information presented in a different way. It's been an unusual partnership, like cats and dogs sleeping together.
Are there any other questions? If not, if you guys can join me in thanking our panel.